The the screw's sharp metal threads bit up Bob's fingertips, scoring deeply in the pads. Blood smeared screw head and dripped on the rusty gray metal vent cover Bob was laboring to remove from the wall. Bob had already freed two of the vent screws. He tried to bend the cover back away from the wall, but the metal was too strong. He had to get the third screw out so he could swing the cover out of the way. The vent was large, big enough, Bob thought, for him to get through. It had to be. If it wasn't, well, he couldn't think about that. Come on, he muttered. The words came out in staggered gasps because Bob's heart was pounding so violently it felt like it was beating the air out of his lungs. The heavy bang sounded behind Bob, a loud bang that vibrated the table Bob was crouching under. Involuntarily, Bob raised his head, whacking on the table as he turned to look at the shoulders, the throbbing that erupted in his skull adding scintopia to his rapid-fire breathing. Bob stared at the barrier he built up in front of the office metal door. Was it going to hold? Another bang. This one, reverberating through the office. Bob felt the vibration course through all the bones of his body. The vibration turned into panic convulsing as one of the filing cabinets he piled on the top of the desk teetered. The desk was wedged against the door, but if the cabinets fell, would the desk stay in one place? The wobbling, flagging cabinet bumped into the desk chair that topped the pile of office cabinets. Topping the pile of office furniture, Bob have cobbled into a blockage. The chair toppled over and crashed onto the office linen floor. The desk twitched, but it stayed in place. Ignoring the prickles between his shoulder blades as he rotates away from the door, Bob returned his concentration to the screw. The bloodshine screw stubbornly refused to turn for a couple more seconds. Bob grit his teeth and put all his focus on the screw head, and finally the screw came loose. He dropped it as the vent cover swerved on its ramping screw and sprung away from the opening in the wall. Bob peered into the blank shift extending in front of him. Safety air wafted from the opening. Dust pillowed upward. He suppressed a sneeze. Behind Bob, the fingernails of the blockboard screeched, paraded the defense clang. Bob's head swerved. The filing cabinet was no longer on top of the desk. It lay on the floor, and behind it, the desk began to move away from the doorknob. Bob snuck in his breath and looked around widely for his flashlight. He sat down the club-style light when he began working on the screws. Was it there? Bob spotted the flashlight a few feet to his right. He lunged for it for another deafening metallic thud came from the office door. The overheard speakers hissed, and then they emitted a tiny shriek. Time to go, Bob thought. Flipping on his flashlight, Bob crawled into the narrow desk darkness. More thugs and fams chased him away from the office. He scrabbled as fast as he could. In his 30s, Bob had come to terms with his nerdish looks and receding hairline, but he never felt thrilling in his slight body. For once, though, he was grateful for his narrow shoulders, and even so, he still had to squirm and wriggle his way through the tightened enclose of the van shaft. In spite of the close quarters, he made quick progress. The continued kettle coming from the speakers and the echoes banging thumbs that sounded like they were pursuing Bob fought the Ignis and paid him through the shaft of the lightning speed. In what felt like both seconds and centuries, Bob reached the end of the vent shaft that led away from the office. The patches slid. Bob aimed his flashlight beam left and right. The light reveals the same thing in both directions. Darkness and more darkness. Sweat spun Bob's eye and dripped off his nose. The stench of his perspiration was fitting in the confined space. Bob set down his flashlight so he could wipe his face. Another scourging howl came from the building's speakers. Bob snatched up his flashlight. Without thinking anymore, he headed down the left passageway, losing himself again in frantic crawling that defied his ability to coordinate seconds or minutes. Bob campered forward until he found himself looking at a vent cover like the one that he removed in the office. Bob groaned. Was he trapped? If this vent cover was screwed on as secure as the one in the office, the canophone coming in the speakers carcinosity. The vent shaft shook and the entire building quaked. Bob felt his flashlight and used the end of it to pound on the vent cover. To his shock and relief, the vent cover came loose. It flipped away from the shaft and slapped the wall in the crash that made Bob cringe. Even above the din that filled the building, the sound carried, which meant it easily gave away Bob's location. Bob quickly pulled himself out of the vent shaft every nerve ending in his body on alert. Bob stood and whirled in a circle, shining his flashlight around him. When the flashlight beam revealed stacks of boxes, restaurant supplies, and a closed front gross glass door, Bob let out a pent-up breath. He was the one in the pizzeria's storage rooms, and he was alone for a moment. Bob took a step forward the door, reaching for a knob. He hesitated. What was on the other side of the door? Although Bob could see no looming shadows beyond the murky glass, his heart rate ratcheted up a couple more notches. His chest felt concreted, like metal bands were constricting around him. Bob really did not want to open the door that stood between his current temporary safety and what was roaming loose beyond the door. But he couldn't stay here forever. Locking himself in the office hadn't work. Hiding in here wouldn't work either. He had to get out of the building. Bob turned the knob and threw open the door. Willing himself not to think, Bob stepped out of the storage room, checking left and right and seeing nothing but dimly lit hallways. Bob took off a sprint, his rubber-soled athletic shoes slapping on the back and white checked floor. Bob reached the hallway corner in seconds. He rounded and his gaze locked on the glowing red exit sign above. The door was just 30 feet away. Pumping up by hope, Bob shot toward the door. Bob hit the door's metal crack at top speed, fully expecting it cultivate through the door with a sweet freedom of the night outside. Bob was shocked when his body bounced backward off the bar. He limited his arms and kept his balance. Barely for a few seconds he lung open his hope, too. He threw himself at the door. Even though Bob knew he had no bulk, he wasn't a small guy. At 5'11", he had a little heft. Surely he could bash the door open, but no. The door remained closed, like it was nailed shut. Bob tried again and again. Finally, puffing heavily, he leaned against the door, and that's when he heard it. Dibbity-bum-bum-dum-dum-ba. The sing-like voice echoed through the building as it came towards Bob, and its playful tone was like a spider crawling up Bob's spine. Goosebumps erupted in his bare arms. Bob turned and looked down the long hallway behind him. As soon as he did, a corridor's lights went out. What little illumination there turned into utter dark blackness. Dum-dum-dum-dum. The mocking tones come closer. Bob lost it. Turning, he pounded on the exit door. "Help! Someone! Help me!" Bob screamed so loudly that the words erupted his throat like a metal file scoring at his vocal voice. In spite of his cries, though, Bob easily heard a pounding footstep that's rushing up behind him, going rapid, his whole body imbobulated by his brain's inability to accept what was happening. Bob waited for an inevitable attack that would clinging in a tenuous thread of awareness. Bob's brain attempted to process all the stimuli that had bombarded his senses. His eyes registered fluorescent lights, at once scratching bright and then terrifying dark. His feet rapidly burning pressure, vial-like champing across the arches. His spine communicate jarring and bumping, cracking in the seeming endless rock-hard expanse. His forehead felt warm with a thick moisture. It ran into his ears. Bob blinked as his brain worked to make sense of all the bloody reports. He attempted to move. As soon as Bob tried to get his body to follow his command, his brain reached a conclusion about his situation. Bob lifted his head and looked down at the length of his prone body, who was being dragged down in the hallway by his feet. Looking into the on and off shadows, Bob couldn't see what had hold him, but he didn't need to see it. He knew what it was. Corkscrewing his spine in the attempt to get away, Bob's head slammed against the floor beneath him. He felt like hip knock against something sharp and realized he was being dragged around the corner. Stiffening, his stomach flip-flopped in the realization of where he was. The grayscale intermitting light was abruptly replaced by a swirling capsicum of color, red and yellow and purple and blue. Floodlight steam swapped and radiance across Bob's field of vision as his fingers flexed in his attempt to grab something, anything, to stop his progress towards whatever he was being dragged. Bob recognized the deuterium log forgotten fun. His hand gazed over a party hat. His thighs rubbed against a table leg. Bob was tugged hard and his body twisted. As it did, Bob's gaze landed on the wall covered in children's drawing. The yellow curry paper covered and crayon rendered stick figures, ruffling in the air current as Bob was heaved past the wall. Bob had looked at the wall long and hard just a few hours earlier, well before he realized the danger that he was in. The wall had given him the creeps, serious creeps. One drawing in particular, one that was noticeably larger than the others, had captured his attention. This drawing hung as if it was a central masterpiece of an exhibit. Decapitated large yellow bunny rabbit standing hand to hand with 5 happy children. In spite of the glancing suggesting by a cheerful scene, the image had troubled Bob. As Bob caught a glimpse of the rabbit's drawing now, he felt bile rise on the back of his throat. He tried to scissor his leg to free himself from the captor. The motion did nothing but amped up the pressure around his leg. Bob was yanked hard, his head smack against the wall as he went around yet another corner. For a few seconds he thought he heard the distant sounds of laughing children. Then the hint of consciousness that had surfaced to make him aware of the surroundings once again sank beneath the layer of cobbled dullness. Bob, coward that he felt he was, welcomed the muffled understanding, unwilling to face the truth of what was happening, and what was about to happen. He slipped into a dreamlike state that eased the hard edges of his predicament. He let himself float out of reality until suddenly his body was whipped from the floor and thrown. When Bob's back smacked into the cold metal, his mind was jarred in full alertness. His gaze immediately scanned his surroundings as he took the pinching, pressing steel wrapping itself from his back, buttocks, and thighs. Bob cried out in an attempt to leap from the metal chair he knew he was in. Before his muscles could lift up upward, a green, illuminated stone of a button on the side of the chair, and metal restraints snapped into place around his waist. A thick leather strap snugly tightly around his chest. Bob raved, but he knew he was wasting his energy. The parts and service room, Bob thought. Of all the eerie rooms in the pizzeria that he had been hired to guard, this was the room that had freaked him out the most when he first seen it. Its walls were lined with metal sheathing that surround multiple stainless steel worktables, indestructible looking at metal receivers that in no way conjured feelings of relaxation. The parts and service room was stuffed full of tools, wires, fasteners, and various disassembled robotic endoskeletons. Metal feet and metal arms and hands and legs and elbows and shoulders were tangled on shelves and strewn across the work tables. When Bob had first seen the room, he felt like he was standing in a robotic torture chamber. He had quickly backed down and slammed the door closed. Once again, Bob thrashed the chair using all the strength he could muster. He tried to free himself. The chair held on to him, and it then snapped backward, stretching him flat. As Bob was sustaining a massive furry brown bear mask loomed over him, Bob screamed. As Bob's pointless brawling filled the room, the bear mask opened up. The two halves of the bear peeled back like wings of a beetle, expanding outward as the fur parted. Spinning robotic mechanisms filled Bob's vision. Razor sharp and in constant motion, the inside of the bear mask was a blur of clicking, clanking, knife-like protrusions and pincers. Every edge of exposed metal was a small lethal weapon that could easily pierce human skin. Bob began fighting like an animal caught in the metal tooth trap. He whipped his head from side to side. He bucked his torso. He kicked his legs. At first, Bob felt like his efforts were futile, but then he felt one of the arm strings begin to wiggle. Straining to crane his neck, Bob looked at his wrist. He couldn't see what was losing, but something loosened was. Maybe a bolt was coming free. Despair of that had been clinging on Bob since he hit the metal chair its grip, just a little. Bob felt himself start to think he might be able to escape. The mask's first cutting assault slashed into Bob's jaw, overcome by the stabs of slices that ripped on his forehead and cheeks and jabbed in his eyes and mouth. Bob realized escape was impossible. So was survival.